My name is Lila Chapman, and for 14 years I believed that dedication and brilliant engineering could actually make a difference in the corporate world. I was optimizing neural network architectures on a Thursday afternoon when the email arrived in my inbox at 3:42 p.m. Eastern Time. Subject line: Personnel update. Action required today. My chest tightened before I even opened it. You know that feeling when you're about to receive devastating news that will change everything? That was me staring at my laptop screen in our Cambridge office, watching my career dissolve in real time. The message was 5 sentences long. 14 years of groundbreaking work reduced to sterile corporate language that could have been generated by a template. Dear Ms. Chapman, after comprehensive evaluation, we have determined that your position at Topmark Systems is no longer aligned with our strategic objectives. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Please coordinate with Human Resources for equipment return by close of business. We appreciate your past contributions to the organization. That was it. No warning call, no in-person conversation, no explanation beyond strategic alignment. Just a digital termination notice delivered with all the compassion of a parking violation. My fingers were trembling as I processed those 5 sentences. 14 years of my life. I'd sacrificed my daughter's soccer championships for critical system deployments. Missed anniversary dinners for client emergencies that couldn't wait until morning. And this was the gratitude I received. I remained frozen at my desk for nearly 20 minutes, observing my colleagues immersed in their code reviews, completely oblivious that I'd just become invisible in the building. The absurd part? That morning I'd been fine-tuning the machine learning framework that powered our most lucrative client contracts. Topmark Systems processed over $3.7 billion in automated transactions annually, and the predictive algorithms I'd architected from scratch handled computational loads that would overwhelm our competitors' infrastructure. Microsoft's entire Azure machine learning pipeline that operated on neural networks I designed during midnight coding sessions while my family slept downstairs. Growing up in Buffalo, New York, my father worked at the steel plant for 42 years. Mom taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. We shopped at discount stores and considered Red Lobster a celebration meal. Dad always said, "Sweetheart, there's builders and there's talkers in this world. The builders create the future. The talkers just take credit for it. Be a builder." I never had the privilege of an Ivy League computer science education like my colleagues. What I possessed was determination and countless sleepless nights mastering machine learning frameworks while my high school friends were at parties. I'd been the cornerstone of Topmark's artificial intelligence division for over a decade. The predictive models I developed had prevented 7 major system failures in the past 18 months alone, outages that would have cost Topmark over $140 million in client penalties and reputation damage. The neural architecture I'd created maintained a 99.94% accuracy rate on financial forecasting, industry-leading performance. When Tesla needed their autopilot systems to process real-time data more efficiently, they licensed my pattern recognition algorithms. When Amazon's recommendation engine started producing bizarre suggestions during their holiday surge 3 years back, they contracted me directly to redesign their entire approach. While Derek Stone and his executive committee sat in their glass conference rooms discussing synergistic opportunities and market disruption, I was deep in the technical trenches building the actual infrastructure that supported their $2.3 billion market valuation. Derek Stone embodied everything I wasn't. At 55, he represented pure East Coast establishment privilege. Harvard MBA, generational wealth, the type of executive who casually mentioned his weekend sailing trips with hedge fund managers like they were neighborhood barbecues. He owned a Tesla Model S Plaid, resided in a $6.8 million estate in Newton, and possessed that distinctive tech executive confidence that comes from never questioning where your next mortgage payment originates. But here's what infuriated me most. Derek's concept of technical leadership involved forwarding Wired magazine articles with one-word messages like interesting. He'd once questioned our AI team about making our machine learning models more user-friendly because clients were complaining about processing delays. Last quarter, he'd invested $650,000 in Deloitte consultants to explain basic neural network concepts to the board of directors, fundamentals I could teach to a motivated undergraduate in an afternoon. His technical presentations consisted of buzzword compilations from consulting white papers, delivered with the authority of someone who'd never trained a single algorithm in his professional life. In retrospect, the warning signals had been accumulating for weeks. David from Human Resources had begun avoiding direct conversation during our departmental meetings. The traditional Friday afternoon team gatherings had mysteriously excluded me from recent invitations. Even my direct reports appeared uncomfortable when I inquired about their project timelines. But I was too absorbed in optimizing our deep learning models to recognize the political undercurrents. The financial obligations were overwhelming. We carried a $840,000 mortgage on our 5-bedroom colonial in Lexington. My mother's extended care facility bills from her Alzheimer's treatment were accumulating, $31,000 monthly even with insurance coverage. Elise was 16 and already researching MIT, like her mother. Sophie was 13 and passionate about her robotics club competitions. The cardiologist had been monitoring my irregular heartbeat for months, documenting it as stress-induced arrhythmia during my most recent examination. He'd actually prescribed immediate lifestyle modifications on my chart. Medical terminology for this career is destroying your health. But that commitment extracted a devastating personal cost. I'd missed Elisa's regional science fair victory last spring because a coordinated cyber attack had compromised our servers during peak trading hours. Skipped Sophie's robotics demonstration in November when a major client threatened to terminate their $18 million contract over a processing speed issue I needed to resolve immediately. Jared, my husband, had stopped asking when I'd return home for family dinners. He'd simply prepare my meal and store it with a note. Another late night revolutionizing artificial intelligence? For years, my professional relationship with Derek had been superficially respectful. He nodded approvingly during my quarterly technical presentations, occasionally inserting phrases like, "Outstanding innovation, Lila," or "This represents exactly the breakthrough thinking that distinguishes us from competitors." I believed we maintained mutual professional regard. I assumed my dedication held genuine meaning for him. How catastrophically wrong that assumption proved. Security personnel escorted me from the building that Thursday evening. Carlos, the night guard who'd worked there nearly as long as I had, appeared genuinely bewildered. We discussed his daughter's engineering program at Northeastern every morning for years, along with his wife's small business dreams. "See you tomorrow, Ms. Chapman," he called, unaware that tomorrow would bring dramatic changes for both our routines. "Take care, Carlos," I responded, lacking the courage to explain that everything would be different starting now. The commute home blurred into Route 128 traffic and NPR analysis from the evening broadcast. I kept the radio volume high to suppress the questions churning through my mind. Why this timing? What had triggered this decision? Was this genuinely about cost reduction? Or had I missed some larger organizational shift happening behind closed doors? That evening, I followed the natural response pattern when your professional world implodes. I ordered Thai food from our neighborhood restaurant, opened a bottle of wine, and attempted to process the situation logically. Jared discovered me on the living room couch around 10, laptop open, already browsing employment opportunities on professional networking sites. The girls were upstairs completing homework assignments, completely unaware that Mom's substantial income had just vanished. "How serious is this situation?" Jared asked, settling beside me with his own wine glass. He'd been working as a structural engineer at a Boston consulting firm for 11 years, so he understood how to interpret stress indicators in professional contexts. "Serious," I replied. No mention of severance compensation. They simply eliminated me after 14 years of building their entire AI infrastructure from the ground up. We'd been married for 19 years. He possessed enough insight to see beyond my calm exterior to the rage building underneath. "There has to be additional context here," he said. "Companies don't arbitrarily fire their lead AI architects without substantial justification, particularly not the person who created their entire machine learning foundation." He was absolutely correct, naturally. There was much more to this situation. Significantly more. I simply hadn't discovered it yet. It was during the weekend cleanup of my home office that I uncovered something that transformed everything completely. I was sorting through accumulated files, discarding outdated contracts and expired warranties, when I located a folder labeled Patent Applications 2020. Inside was correspondence from Delaney Crawford that I'd entirely forgotten about. Delaney Crawford had been my machine learning professor at Syracuse University before establishing her own AI research consultancy in Boston. In 2020, she'd contacted me after learning about innovative work I'd completed on adaptive neural networks. The email subject line read, "Patent documentation, absolutely critical." "Lila," the message began, "what you've developed here transcends clever programming. This represents a fundamental breakthrough in how neural networks adapt to changing data patterns. This algorithm doesn't just process information, it predicts optimal network configurations 47 seconds before computational bottlenecks occur, preventing crashes that cost companies hundreds of millions. File the intellectual property protection immediately. Trust my experience on this matter. Large corporations have a tendency to forget the actual origins of their most valuable innovations." My hands were shaking as I reread those words. I remember dismissing her urgency back then. Topmark Systems was my employer. Everything I created belonged to them automatically, right? But Delaney Crawford had been persistent. She'd even connected me with a patent attorney, Daniel Wright, who specialized in artificial intelligence patents and maintained a practice in downtown Boston. The patent had been approved in early 2021, System and Method for Predictive Neural Network Configuration in Real-Time Processing Environments. Patent number US 11,389,742. Filed under my name exclusively, Lila Chapman, sole inventor. $28,000 from our savings account and a home equity loan. Jared had supported my judgment, even when I couldn't adequately explain the long-term implications. I accessed the USPTO database with trembling fingers. "Please remain active. Please remain under my ownership." There it was, still valid, nearly 17 more years remaining on its 20-year term. Then I cross-referenced it with Topmark's internal technical documentation. What I discovered made my blood pressure spike with something I hadn't experienced in years: pure, concentrated fury. My algorithm wasn't simply supporting Topmark's platform. It was Topmark's platform. Every transaction, every client success story, every dollar of their $2.3 billion valuation depended on intellectual property I owned. According to their own SEC regulatory filings, my patented technology generated 91% of Topmark's total revenue. I leaned back in my kitchen chair and began laughing. Actually laughing out loud, forcefully enough that Jared came downstairs to investigate. "Lila, are you okay? Honey, you need to see this." I spread the patent documents across our kitchen table alongside Topmark's financial reports I'd downloaded from their investor relations website. He studied the paperwork, his engineering background making him adept at analyzing complex technical information quickly. "Let me understand this correctly. They terminated you for being redundant." "Exactly right. And this technology you own generates what percentage of their revenue?" 91%. Jared looked up from the documents and smiled, the first authentic smile I'd witnessed from him in months. Derek Stone is about to experience a very challenging year. Monday morning, I drove to Daniel Wright's office in downtown Boston. He was in his early 50s, a former corporate attorney who'd established an independent practice after growing frustrated with partnership politics at firms like Baker and Associates. "Lila Chapman," he said, recognizing me immediately. "I was wondering when you'd contact me. Daniel, I need to understand precisely what I'm sitting on here." We spent 3 hours examining every detail. Topmark had been utilizing my patented technology for nearly 4 years without any licensing agreement. They'd simply assumed employee work products belonged to them automatically. My 2008 employment contract contained no language whatsoever regarding patent assignment. "Every day they use your technology, without proper authorization, they're committing willful patent infringement," Daniel explained. But here's where this becomes particularly interesting. Topmark is in advanced acquisition discussions with Crestline Industries. $920 million transaction, scheduled to close this summer. What happens when Crestline discovers Topmark doesn't own their core technology? The deal collapses immediately. No board would approve acquiring a company facing potential patent litigation worth hundreds of millions. That afternoon, I contacted Delaney Crawford. "Lila, I've been anticipating this call for 4 years," she said immediately. "You remember what I told you about documentation? You said companies forget where their innovations originate. They don't just forget, they convince themselves they never needed the original innovators. Derek Stone is about to learn that lesson in the most expensive way possible. What's your strategy?" I'd been considering that question all day. I have 2 options: contact Derek and negotiate terms, or allow him to discover the truth during due diligence. The first option gets you money. The second gets you justice. After 14 years of loyalty repaid with corporate boilerplate, justice seems significantly more satisfying. Delaney Crawford chuckled. Companies like Topmark treat their technical talent as disposable resources. They forget that innovation comes from individuals, not organizational charts. Sometimes the most valuable lessons are the ones that cost the most to learn. I spent the following days researching Derek Stone's background thoroughly. His LinkedIn profile represented a masterclass in inherited privilege, father's connections to 4 different venture capital firms, board positions acquired through family networks, lateral transfers between executive roles without ever building anything substantial. The man had never written a functional algorithm in his life, never spent an all-nighter debugging a critical neural network. While I was teaching myself advanced deep learning from Stanford's online coursework at 2 a.m., Derek was probably at networking events discussing paradigm shifts and disruptive technologies. Internal documents I obtained through former colleagues revealed he'd hired external consultants 23 times in 3 years to explain basic AI concepts to the board. The consulting expenses alone totaled over $1.2 million, more than 4 times my annual salary. Meanwhile, the acquisition news was generating significant coverage. TechCrunch called it transformational for the AI industry. The Wall Street Journal quoted Derek about pivotal technological convergence. MIT Technology Review featured him on their Innovators to Watch list. My former colleagues were posting enthusiastic LinkedIn updates, completely unaware their CEO's biggest deal was built on technology he didn't own. Meanwhile, my stress-induced heart palpitations had disappeared for the first time in months. Daniel called Friday afternoon. Crestline's legal team initiated their intellectual property audit. Based on typical timelines, they'll discover your patent within 10 business days. What happens then? Derek Stone experiences the worst day of his professional career. I considered calling him, providing advance warning, and negotiating licensing terms. But then I remembered that Thursday email. 5 sentences. 14 years reduced to strategic alignment. For 14 years, I'd felt like a replaceable component in Derek's corporate machine. Now I understood the truth. He was nothing without my innovations. The company, the acquisition, his entire career trajectory, all constructed on my work. Derek had discarded me like obsolete equipment. Time to demonstrate what happens when you disrespect the person who built your technological empire. Let them discover it, I told Daniel. Let's observe how far they progress before Derek realizes he doesn't actually own his most valuable asset. That weekend, I helped Elise debug her robotics project code in our garage, actually present for once instead of mentally optimizing neural networks. When she asked why I seemed so relaxed, I told her sometimes patience yields returns in ways you never anticipate. The waiting game had commenced, and for the first time in years, I held all the advantages. The call arrived on a Wednesday morning while I was helping Sophie practice her presentation for the regional science competition. My phone displayed an unknown number with a 617 area code, classic Boston business line. I almost ignored it, but intuition made me answer. "Lila, this is Derek Stone. We need to discuss this immediately." His voice had lost all its characteristic executive polish. Gone was the smooth confidence that had impressed investors and intimidated competitors for years. He sounded like someone who'd just discovered his entire foundation was built on sand. "Hello, Derek. I'm surprised to hear from you. Last time we communicated, it was through a 5-sentence email. Stop the games, Lila. You know exactly why I'm calling. We just received the preliminary IP audit from Crestline's legal team. There's a significant issue with patent US 11,389,742. I let the silence extend while Sophie refined her presentation slides. The irony wasn't lost on me, helping my daughter solve problems while Derek's world crumbled. I'm not sure what you mean, Derek. Could you be more specific? Don't play naive with me. That algorithm is the foundation of our entire AI infrastructure. Our clients process trillions of data points through that system daily. Google, JP Morgan Chase, half the Fortune 100, they all depend on it. If there's some kind of ownership dispute, there's no dispute, Derek. The patent is very clear about who invented the technology and who owns it. Maybe you should have paid attention to who is actually building your company instead of hiring $1.2 million worth of consultants to explain it to you. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear his breathing through the phone. Look, Lila, we can resolve this situation. Maybe there was an oversight in the original employment paperwork. We can retroactively create a licensing agreement, making this problem disappear. What do you want? Stock options? A consulting contract? We're reasonable people here. Reasonable people don't terminate loyal employees by email, Derek. And I'm not interested in anything retroactive. That would be fraud, wouldn't it? Though I suppose fraud is probably routine for someone like you. Lila, you need to understand what you're doing here. This acquisition affects hundreds of jobs, thousands of clients, millions of users. You can't just destroy a $920 million deal because you're upset about a layoff. I looked at Sophie, absorbed in perfecting her presentation, completely focused on solving complex problems. 14 years I'd missed moments like this for Derek's company. 14 years of choosing his crises over my family. I'm not destroying anything, Derek. I'm just a person with a patent who got terminated by email after building your entire AI infrastructure from scratch. What happens next is entirely your decision. Name your price. Seriously. Whatever you want. What I wanted was respect after 14 years of making you wealthy. What I wanted was a phone call instead of a form letter. What I wanted was for you to remember that real people built the foundation you've been taking credit for. I hung up on Derek Stone that Wednesday morning, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, complete control over my own professional destiny. The next morning brought absolute chaos. My phone rang 17 times before 10 a.m. Calls from Topmark's general counsel, their CTO, and what seemed like every corporate law firm in Boston. I ignored them all and spent the morning at the local fitness center, working through a swimming session that felt particularly therapeutic. The messages were increasingly frantic. Subject lines ranged from professional, urgent patent licensing discussion, to desperate, time-sensitive business matter. Please respond immediately. The most intriguing call came from Crestline's chief legal officer, Amanda Ross, a name I recognized from Harvard Business Review articles about complex corporate litigation. Ms. Chapman, this is Amanda Ross from Crestline's Industries. I believe we need to have a conversation about patent US 11,389,742 and its implications for our pending acquisition. I'm hoping we can find a mutually beneficial resolution. Mutually beneficial. Corporate speak for you have us completely trapped. Please don't destroy us. I called Daniel Wright first. Lila, my phone hasn't stopped ringing since yesterday. Half the law firms in Boston want to represent Topmark in settlement negotiations. The other half want to represent you in litigation. I've never witnessed anything quite like this. What's your assessment of the situation? Crestline's is sophisticated. They knew exactly what to look for in the IP audit. When they found your patent powering 91% of Topmark's revenue, their deal team probably called an emergency board meeting. No company acquires technology they don't own. Derek appeared at my neighborhood coffee shop Saturday morning. I watched him from my corner table, standing near his Tesla in the parking lot. The car looked absurdly out of place among the Subarus and Hondas, just like Derek looked out of place in his wrinkled designer suit. He'd aged a decade in a week. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expensive clothes looked slept in, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. The confident executive who delivered polished presentations to venture capitalists was gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely desperate. I debated whether to approach him, but curiosity prevailed. "Lila, thank God," he said when I appeared. "We need to resolve this situation before it destroys everything." "Everything? Or just your acquisition?" "Look, I made mistakes. The layoffs were handled poorly. I should have called you personally, should have offered you a proper severance package, should have shown more respect for your contributions. But we can fix this." It was fascinating observing someone who'd wielded absolute power over my professional life just weeks ago now pleading for mercy in a suburban parking lot. He looked diminished somehow, smaller. "Derek, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to license my patent to whoever wants to use it. Fair market rates, standard terms, no exclusivity agreements. If Topmark wants to continue using my technology, you can pay for it just like everyone else. But the acquisition, Crestlines won't proceed without clean IP. Their board is meeting Monday to review the audit results. Sounds like you should have considered that before you decided I was unnecessary. Lila, please. I know I screwed up, but think about all the people this affects. David from HR, Carlos the security guard, all the engineers on your old team. They don't deserve to lose their jobs because of my mistake. Interesting how you care about other people's jobs now. Where was that concern when you were firing the person who built your platform?" His shoulders sagged. "What do you want from me? I want you to understand that actions have consequences. I want you to remember that the people who actually build things matter more than the people who just talk about building things. And I want you to live with the knowledge that you destroyed your own company because you were too arrogant to respect the talent that made you successful." Derek's face went ashen. "You're really going to let the acquisition die?" "I'm not letting anything die, Derek's. You killed it the moment you sent that email. I'm just not resurrecting it for you." The news broke Monday afternoon. TechCrunch ran the headline, "Topmark Crestline acquisition collapses amid patent dispute." The Wall Street Journal was more direct. $920 million deal dies as AI giant discovers it doesn't own key technology. Derek's statement was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak. While we're disappointed that certain technical issues couldn't be resolved within the acquisition timeline, Topmark remains committed to our innovative AI solutions and our valued clients. What he didn't mention was that Topmark's stock price had dropped 47% in after-hours trading, wiping out nearly $1.1 billion in shareholder value. The company that had deemed me unnecessary was now facing potential bankruptcy if they couldn't secure a license to use their own core technology. Daniel called that evening with an update. Topmark's board called an emergency meeting. Word is they're voting on Derek's future tomorrow morning. And let's just say updating his LinkedIn might not be Derek's biggest priority right now. Jared found me on our back deck that night, watching Sophie and Elise work on their science projects together. "How are you feeling about all this?" he asked. "You know what's strange? I'm not angry anymore. I'm not even particularly satisfied about Derek's situation. I just feel liberated." Liberated? For the first time in 14 years, I don't have to worry about someone else's emergency becoming my crisis. I don't have to choose between their deadlines and our family. I get to decide what matters. Sophie called over from the picnic table. "Mom, you think this neural network design will work for my robotics competition? Come here, sweetheart. Let's optimize your algorithm together." For the first time in years, nothing was more important than my daughter's artificial intelligence project. Derek Stone was terminated by Topmark's board on Friday morning. The official statement cited strategic differences and failure to manage critical business relationships. His replacement was the CTO, Helen Torres, a brilliant engineer who'd actually started in the trenches before moving into management. Helen had been there since the early days and understood what it meant to build something from scratch. Helen called me that same afternoon. Unlike Derek's panicked desperation, Helen's approach was straightforward and professional. "Lila, this is Helen Torres. I'm sure you know I've just been named interim CEO. I'd like to discuss licensing terms for your patent." "I'm listening. We both know Topmark can't survive without your technology. We're prepared to offer fair market value for a non-exclusive license, plus back pay for the 4 years we've been using it without authorization. What kind of numbers are we talking about? $150 million for the license, plus $35 million in back pay. Total of $185 million. I nearly dropped the phone. $185 million. For a patent I'd almost forgotten existed. That's substantial. Lila, I've reviewed your personnel file from top to bottom. I was there when you single-handedly prevented that Christmas Eve system failure in 2019. I watched you stop 4 major security breaches that would have killed us. Derek's handling of your termination was inexcusable. You built this company's foundation, and we should have recognized that years ago. That was the closest thing to an apology I was going to receive from Topmark Systems. And honestly, it was sufficient. Within 4 weeks, I had 8 competing offers from major tech companies who wanted to license my patent. Google led the pack with $78 million upfront plus 28% royalties on all implementations. IBM offered $71 million plus consulting contracts. Microsoft threw in partnership opportunities that would have made my old salary look like pocket change. The technology industry was smaller than people realized. Word had spread about the woman from Buffalo who'd brought down a nearly billion-dollar acquisition with a single patent. TechCrunch ran a follow-up article titled The Lila Chapman Effect: How One Patent Changed Silicon Valley's Approach to Engineering Talent. Forbes called it the revenge of the builders. Daniel Wright was having the time of his professional life. I've been practicing patent law for 18 years, he told me during our final strategy session. I've never seen anything create this much industry buzz. You've got CEOs calling emergency meetings to audit their own IP portfolios. Meanwhile, Topmark Systems was hemorrhaging clients faster than their servers could process contract cancellations. Microsoft had already migrated their Azure machine learning infrastructure to IBM, citing concerns about platform stability. 5 Fortune 100 companies followed suit within days. The tech press was calling it the Topmark Exodus. The licensing agreement with Topmark was signed on a Thursday morning in Daniel's downtown office. Helen Torres signed for the company, looking relieved that they'd finally secured the rights to their own core technology. $185 million for a non-exclusive license to patent US $11,389,742. I used part of the settlement to pay off her mortgage that same day. Jared actually cried when I told him we owned our house free and clear. No more worrying about layoffs, he said, embracing me in our kitchen. No more choosing between family time and someone else's emergency. The girls didn't fully understand what had happened, but they knew Mom wasn't stressed about money anymore. My irregular heartbeat at my next cardiology appointment was completely normal for the first time in years. Whatever you're doing differently, Dr. Peterson said, keep doing it. 8 months later, Delaney Crawford called with a proposition. Lila, I've been thinking about expanding my consultancy. What would you say to partnering with me? Focus on helping individual inventors protect their intellectual property. What would we call it? How about Foster Chapman IP Advisory? We opened our doors 4 months later in a renovated warehouse space in Cambridge, not far from where Daniel had his practice. Our mission was simple: help working engineers and programmers understand their rights and protect their innovations before companies could exploit them. Our first client was a brilliant young programmer from Detroit named Alex Johnson, who developed a revolutionary approach to quantum computing optimization. She reminded me of myself at 28, talented, hardworking, and completely naive about the business side of technology. Here's the most important advice I can give you, I told her during our initial consultation. Always file the paperwork. Always protect your work. Document everything. Companies have a way of forgetting where their best ideas actually came from, but patents have long memories. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd learned more about business strategy from being betrayed than I had from 14 years of loyal employment. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's building something better and making sure it can never be taken away from you again. Derek Stone landed at a smaller firm 10 months later with a significantly reduced title and a fraction of his previous salary. I heard through the Boston tech community that he'd been essentially blacklisted from CEO positions at major technology companies. Word travels fast when you mismanage a deal catastrophically. Business schools were already using the Topmark Crestline collapse as a case study in the importance of respecting technical talent. Within 20 months, I'd licensed my patent to 9 major AI companies. Topmark's market share dropped from 34% to 11% as clients migrated to platforms with more stable IP foundations and better engineering cultures. The company that had deemed me unnecessary was now a cautionary tale about what happens when you forget who actually builds your success. These days, I sleep peacefully at night, knowing that every algorithm I write belongs to me until I decide otherwise. I coach Elise's robotics team on weekends. She made the state championship as a junior, and I haven't missed a single competition. Jared and I actually have dinner together most nights. Sophie's science fair presentations are no longer optional. They're the highlight of my week. Last month, Elise asked me what I learned from the whole experience with Topmark. Well, sweetheart, I learned that loyalty is a two-way street. I learned that your work is worth more than you think it is. And I learned that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is getting fired. Really? Really? Because it forced me to value myself the way I should have all along. When young engineers ask me for career advice, I tell them the same thing Delaney Crawford told me back in 2020. Always have a backup plan because corporations have a way of forgetting that their success stands on the shoulders of the people who actually build things. The patent expires in 2041. By then, Elise will be in her 30s, maybe with children of her own. Sophie will be starting her career, hopefully in something she's passionate about. And I'll be able to tell them that their college educations were paid for by their mother's refusal to be treated like she didn't matter. David didn't defeat Goliath with luck. He defeated him with preparation and one perfect shot. If you're out there grinding away at some corporation, building their dreams while neglecting your own, remember this story. Document your innovations. File the paperwork. Protect your work. Because companies will exploit you until you're exhausted, then discard you without hesitation. But if you're smart, if you document your worth and protect your work, you can turn the tables when they least expect it. And if they ever fire you by email after years of loyal service, well, you'll be ready. That's worth more than all the stock options in Silicon Valley. The transformation in my daily life was remarkable. Instead of waking up at 5 a.m. to check server logs and system alerts, I now started my mornings with coffee and actual conversations with my family. The constant buzzing of my phone with work emergencies had been replaced by the peaceful sounds of a normal household. Elise had initially been worried about our financial situation when I explained I'd been let go from Topmark. "Are we going to be okay, Mom?" She'd asked with the practical concern of a teenager who understood that mortgages and college tuition were real things. "We're going to be more than okay, sweetheart," I told her. Sometimes when one door closes, a much better one opens. I couldn't have predicted how prophetic those words would prove to be. The patent licensing deals continued to roll in throughout that first year. Each new agreement validated what I'd always known but had never fully valued. The work I'd created wasn't just clever programming. It was genuinely revolutionary technology that had transformed how artificial intelligence systems operated across multiple industries. Amazon reached out through their legal team with an offer that made even Daniel Wright's eyes widen. They're offering $95 million upfront plus royalties that could reach $300 million over the life of the patent, he told me during one of our monthly check-ins. This is generational wealth, Lila. Generational wealth. The concept was almost surreal for someone who'd grown up clipping coupons and shopping clearance racks. My parents had worked their entire lives just to maintain middle-class stability. Now I was in a position to ensure my daughters would never have to worry about student loans or mortgages or whether they could afford to take unpaid internships to build their careers. But perhaps more importantly, I was building something that mattered. Foster Chapman IP Advisory was becoming known throughout the Boston tech community as the firm that actually protected individual inventors. We weren't just another corporate law practice focused on helping big companies acquire intellectual property from smaller players. Our second major client was a former Google engineer named Talia Ford who developed a breakthrough in natural language processing while working on their translation algorithms. Google had simply assumed they owned everything she created, despite the fact that her employment contract had significant gaps in its IP assignment clauses. I almost didn't call. Talia Ford admitted during our first meeting. I kept thinking, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they do own it. Maybe I'm just being greedy. The self-doubt was heartbreakingly familiar. Talia, I told her, I spent 14 years convincing myself that my loyalty was more important than my rights. Don't make that mistake. 6 months later, Talia signed a licensing deal with Google for $78 million. They kept the rights to use her technology in their translation services, but now they were paying market rates for the privilege. More importantly, Talia retained ownership and could license the same technology to other companies. The ripple effects of these success stories began spreading throughout the industry. Engineers at major tech companies started asking more questions about IP ownership. Employment lawyers reported a surge in clients seeking contract reviews before accepting new positions. The traditional model of everything you create belongs to us was finally being challenged by people who understood their own value. Crestline Industries, the company that had originally planned to acquire Topmark, reached out to me directly 6 months after their deal collapsed. Their new CEO, Janet Morrison, I need to change that name. Their new CEO, Janet Sullivan, had been brought in specifically to rebuild their reputation after the failed acquisition. Ms. Chapman, she said during our video call, I want to discuss a different kind of partnership. We're not looking to acquire your technology. We want to invest in your advisory firm. The offer was intriguing. $50 million in funding to help Foster Chapman expand nationwide, with the goal of creating a new standard for how tech companies approach intellectual property relationships with their employees. Why would you want to do that? I asked. Because what happened with Topmark could happen to any of us, Janet replied. We spend billions on acquisitions without truly understanding what we're buying. Your firm could help prevent those disasters while also ensuring brilliant people like you get the recognition and compensation they deserve. The investment would allow us to hire 20 more attorneys, open offices in Silicon Valley and Seattle, and develop educational programs for both engineers and corporate legal teams. It was an opportunity to systematize change across the entire industry. Jared was initially skeptical. Are you sure you want to get back into the corporate world? Even as a consultant? You've finally found peace. He was right to be cautious. The last thing I wanted was to recreate the stress and family sacrifices that had characterized my years at Topmark. This is different, I explained. I'm not building someone else's empire anymore. I'm building something that protects people like me from being exploited. The distinction mattered enormously. Instead of working to make Derek Stone richer, I'd be working to ensure that brilliant engineers couldn't be discarded and forgotten. Delaney Crawford was enthusiastic about the expansion. Lila, we could change how this entire industry operates. Imagine a world where companies have to actually respect their technical talent because they know those people understand their rights. It was an ambitious vision, but one that felt achievable given what we'd already accomplished. The news of Crestline's investment in Foster Chapman made headlines across the tech industry. Harvard Business Review ran a feature article titled The New IP Economy: How One Woman's Patent Fight Changed Silicon Valley. The piece detailed not just my story with Topmark, but the broader implications for how intellectual property rights were evolving in the technology sector. The Chapman case represents a fundamental shift in power dynamics between individual innovators and large corporations, the article concluded. For decades, the tech industry has operated on the assumption that employee-created innovations automatically belong to employers. Chapman's success in retaining and monetizing her own patent rights suggests that assumption may no longer hold. The validation was gratifying, but what really mattered were the individual stories of engineers who reached out to us. A software architect in Austin who'd invented a new database optimization technique. A cybersecurity specialist in Denver who developed a breakthrough in threat detection. A machine learning researcher in Portland who'd created a more efficient neural network training algorithm. Each of them had the same story. They created something valuable, their employers had assumed ownership, and they never questioned whether they deserved better. Our job was to help them understand their rights and protect their innovations before it was too late. Elise, now a senior in high school, had been following my career transformation with keen interest. She'd always been mathematically gifted, but the patent fight had sparked her curiosity about the intersection of technology and law. "Mom, I'm thinking about studying intellectual property law in college," she told me one evening while we worked on calculus problems together. "That's a field that's going to become increasingly important," I replied. "But remember, the law is just a tool. What matters is understanding the technology well enough to protect the people who create it." She nodded thoughtfully, already thinking like someone who could bridge the gap between technical innovation and legal protection. Sophie, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity at her middle school after her robotics team won the regional championship using artificial intelligence algorithms I'd helped her develop. "My mom created the technology that powers half the internet," she'd apparently told her classmates, which wasn't technically accurate, but wasn't entirely wrong either. The success of Foster Chapman allowed us to be selective about our clients. We focused on cases where individual inventors had created genuinely innovative technology but lacked the resources or knowledge to protect their rights. Our fee structure was designed to be accessible. We typically took a percentage of any eventual licensing deals rather than charging upfront fees that struggling inventors couldn't afford. One of our most satisfying cases involved a former Apple engineer named David Kim. Actually, I need to change that surname. A former Apple engineer named David Reynolds who developed a more efficient battery management system for mobile devices. Apple had laid him off during a cost-cutting initiative, then continued using his algorithm in their latest iPhone models. The case took 18 months to resolve, but David eventually signed licensing agreements worth $127 million. More importantly, Apple was forced to acknowledge publicly that they'd been using technology they didn't own, a precedent that made other tech giants much more careful about their IP practices. "I never thought I could take on Apple," David told me after the settlement was finalized. "I figured they had unlimited legal resources, and I was just one person. But you showed me that being right matters more than being big." Those were the moments that made all the stress and long hours worthwhile. The second anniversary of my termination from Topmark arrived on a Thursday, exactly like the original. I spent the morning reviewing licensing agreements for 3 new clients, then took the afternoon off to watch Sophie's science fair presentation. The contrast wasn't lost on me. 2 years earlier, I would have missed the science fair for a client emergency. Now, my client's needs were important, but they weren't more important than my daughter's achievements. Derek Stone had largely disappeared from the Boston tech scene. I'd heard through industry contacts that he was working at a small consulting firm, helping startups with business development. The irony was perfect. The man who'd built his career by taking credit for other people's innovations was now in a position where his success depended entirely on his ability to actually add value. Helen Torres, meanwhile, had done an admirable job rebuilding Topmark. The company had been forced to fundamentally rethink their approach to intellectual property and employee relations. They now offered equity stakes in patents developed by their engineers, provided more generous severance packages, and had implemented formal processes for recognizing technical contributions. "We learned the hard way that brilliant engineers have options," Helen told me during a chance encounter at an industry conference. "Companies that don't treat their technical talent well will lose them to companies that do." It was a lesson that seemed obvious in retrospect, but had taken a nearly billion-dollar disaster to teach. The patent itself continued generating revenue from an ever-expanding list of companies. Netflix had licensed it for their recommendation algorithms. Ford was using it to optimize their autonomous vehicle processing systems. Even NASA had reached out about applications for satellite data analysis. Each new licensing deal validated the fundamental breakthrough I'd achieved and reminded me that Derek Stone had been willing to throw it all away for short-term cost savings. Delaney Crawford and I were invited to speak at MIT's annual Technology and Society Conference about the changing landscape of intellectual property rights. Standing in the same lecture hall where I'd once attended graduate-level computer science courses as a working professional, I felt a profound sense of completion. The traditional employment model in technology assumes that innovation flows one direction, from individual engineers to corporate owners. I told the audience of students, professors, and industry professionals. But innovation is a collaborative process. Engineers build on existing knowledge, combine ideas in new ways, and create value that didn't exist before. When companies recognize and reward that contribution fairly, everyone benefits. The questions from the audience were sophisticated and challenging. A venture capitalist asked whether patent protection for individual employees would discourage corporate investment in research and development. A patent attorney questioned whether the existing legal framework could handle a large-scale shift toward individual IP ownership. These were valid concerns, but they missed the fundamental point. We're not talking about destroying the innovation economy, I explained. We're talking about making it more fair. Companies will still invest in research and development. They'll just have to share the rewards more equitably with the people who actually do the research and development. Elise, who'd accompanied me to the conference, asked one of the most insightful questions during the Q&A. How do you balance protecting individual inventors with the need for companies to have reliable access to the technology they need to operate? It was exactly the kind of question that suggested she was thinking seriously about these issues. That's why licensing agreements exist, I replied. Companies can have reliable access to technology without owning it outright. It's the same model we use in many other industries. Think about how pharmaceutical companies license drug patents or how musicians license their songs. The creator retains ownership while the user pays fair value for access. The conference presentation generated significant media coverage and speaking opportunities. Harvard Law School invited me to guest lecture in their intellectual property course. The Patent and Trademark Office asked me to participate in a panel discussion about innovation policy. Stanford's Business School wanted to develop a case study about Foster Chapman for their entrepreneurship program. Each opportunity reinforced the same message. The traditional power dynamics in technology were shifting, and companies that adapted quickly would thrive while those that resisted change would struggle. The Topmark story had become a cautionary tale, but it was also a roadmap for how things could work better. Jared had been remarkably supportive throughout this entire transformation. As a structural engineer, he understood the satisfaction of building something that would last. You're not just making money, he observed one evening as we reviewed the latest licensing agreements. You're changing how an entire industry thinks about innovation and ownership. He was right. The financial success was gratifying, but the systemic change was more meaningful. Young engineers were entering the job market with a better understanding of their rights. Companies were revising their employment contracts and IP policies. Law schools were adding courses on individual inventor protection. The impact extended beyond just patent law. Companies were starting to realize that treating technical talent as disposable resources was not only ethically problematic, but also economically stupid. The cost of replacing an experienced engineer, recruiting, hiring, training, knowledge transfer, often exceeded the cost of retaining them with better compensation and working conditions. Foster Chapman had grown to 43 employees across 3 offices. We'd successfully represented over 200 individual inventors, securing licensing deals worth more than $3.8 billion in total. More importantly, we'd established precedents that made it easier for future inventors to protect their rights. Our success had also created opportunities for our clients beyond just monetary compensation. Talia Ford, the Google engineer whose natural language processing patent we'd helped protect, had used her licensing revenues to start her own AI company. David Reynolds had become a prominent advocate for inventors' rights and was frequently quoted in technology publications. These entrepreneurs were creating jobs, developing new technologies, and contributing to innovation in ways that wouldn't have been possible if they'd remained trapped in traditional employment relationships. They were proof that protecting individual inventors wasn't just about fairness, it was also about maximizing innovation and economic growth. The 3rd anniversary of my termination from Topmark arrived with little fanfare. I marked the date by signing a licensing agreement with a European telecommunications company that wanted to use my predictive algorithm for their 5G network optimization. The deal was worth $43 million over 5 years, more than I'd earned in my entire 14-year career at Topmark. But the real celebration happened that evening at Sophie's high school graduation. She'd been accepted to MIT's engineering program with a focus on artificial intelligence and robotics. During her valedictorian speech, she mentioned how her mother had taught her that innovation belongs to the innovators, not to the companies that happen to employ them. The audience, Mostly other parents from our upper-middle-class suburb probably didn't fully understand the reference. But I did. And more importantly, Sophie did. She was entering her career with an understanding of her own value that it had taken me 14 years to develop. Elise had also been accepted to MIT, planning to double major in computer science and intellectual property law. Her senior thesis had been titled The Economics of Innovation: How Patent Protection for Individual Inventors Creates More Value for Everyone. It was a sophisticated analysis that drew on economic theory, legal precedents, and real-world case studies, including my own story. I want to help create a world where brilliant people never have to choose between doing innovative work and being treated fairly, she told me while we discussed her career plans. It was a goal I wholeheartedly supported. The transformation in my own daily life continued to be remarkable. I was healthier, both physically and mentally, than I'd been in years. The stress-related health issues that had plagued me during my top mark years had completely disappeared. My relationship with Jared had strengthened as we spent more time together and shared more decisions about our future. Most importantly, I'd learned to value my own contributions appropriately. For 14 years, I'd accepted Top Mark's assessment that I was a replaceable employee whose primary value was her willingness to work long hours for modest compensation. The patent fight had forced me to recognize that my technical innovations were genuinely valuable and that I deserved to be compensated accordingly. This wasn't just about money, though the financial security was certainly appreciated. It was about respect, recognition, and the fundamental principle that people who create value should share in the benefits of that value. Derek Stone and Top Mark had treated me as if my contributions were ordinary and easily replaced. The market had proven otherwise. The patent would continue generating revenue for another 15 years. By the time it expired, Elise and Sophie would be established in their own careers, possibly with children of their own. They would grow up in a world where intellectual property rights for individual inventors were better protected and more widely understood. Foster Chapman IP Advisory had become more than just a law firm. It was a movement toward a more equitable innovation economy. We'd proven that individual inventors could successfully challenge corporate assumptions about intellectual property ownership. More importantly, we'd shown that protecting inventors' rights created more value for everyone, not just the inventors themselves. The story that had begun with a devastating email on a Thursday afternoon had evolved into something I never could have imagined. What felt like the worst professional disaster of my life had actually been the catalyst for the most meaningful and successful chapter of my career. Derek Stone had done me a favor, though I'm sure that wasn't his intention. By firing me so callously, he'd forced me to recognize my own worth and fight for what I deserved. The man who'd thought he could discard me like obsolete equipment had inadvertently created his own most effective competitor. The lesson was clear and applicable far beyond just patent law. Companies that fail to respect and properly compensate their most valuable employees will eventually lose those employees to competitors who understand their worth. In an economy increasingly driven by innovation and intellectual capital, treating technical talent as disposable resources isn't just morally wrong, it's strategically suicidal. For any engineer, programmer, or technical professional reading this story, the message is simple. Document your innovations, understand your rights, and never accept less than you deserve. The technology industry needs your brilliance, your creativity, and your dedication. Make sure you're compensated fairly for providing it. Because somewhere out there, there's another Derek Stone who thinks your contributions are ordinary and easily replaced. And somewhere else, there's a company that will recognize your true value and treat you accordingly. The choice of which one you work for is entirely yours. For years after leaving Top Mark, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at their annual engineering conference. Helen Torres, who'd successfully navigated the company through its post-acquisition crisis, called personally to extend the invitation. "I know this might seem strange," she said, "but I think our engineers would benefit from hearing your story. Not just the patent aspects, but your perspective on innovation, intellectual property, and career development." I was initially reluctant. Why would I want to return to a company that had treated me so poorly? But Helen made a compelling case. "Lila, We've fundamentally changed how we approach IP and employee relations. Your story was a catalyst for that change. Our engineers need to understand not just what happened, but why it happened and how we've evolved. After discussing it with Jared and the girls, I agreed to speak. Walking into Topmark's headquarters for the first time since that Thursday afternoon termination was surreal. The building looked the same, but everything else had changed. The lobby displayed a prominent plaque, Innovation Recognition Wall, with photos and brief biographies of employees whose technical contributions had been formally recognized by the company. My former office had been converted into a patent development center, where engineers could get help with documenting and filing their innovations. Carlos, the security guard who'd worked there almost as long as I had, was now the facility's safety coordinator, a promotion that came with better pay and benefits. "Miss Chapman," he called out when he saw me. "I never thought I'd see you back here. Congratulations on everything you've accomplished." His genuine warmth reminded me that most of the people at Topmark had been just as surprised by my termination as I was. The engineering conference was held in the same auditorium where I'd given countless technical presentations over the years. Looking out at an audience of about 300 engineers, many of whom I'd worked with directly, I felt a mixture of nostalgia and vindication. 4 years ago, I was terminated from this company by email after 14 years of service. I began. Today, I'm here to share what I learned from that experience, not just about patents and intellectual property, but about understanding your own value and protecting your rights as an innovator. The presentation covered the technical details of my patent, the legal battle with Topmark, and the broader implications for how engineers should think about their careers. But the most important message was personal. Don't let any company, no matter how prestigious or successful, convince you that your contributions are ordinary or easily replaced. During the Q&A session, a young engineer asked, "Do you regret anything about how you handled the situation?" It was a thoughtful question that I'd considered many times. "I regret that it took being fired to recognize my own worth," I replied. "I should have understood the value of my innovations years earlier and negotiated accordingly." Another engineer asked whether individual patent ownership would create conflicts between inventors and their employers. "Good companies will see patent-holding employees as assets, not threats," I explained. "They'll develop licensing arrangements that benefit both parties. Companies that see patents as threats probably aren't places where innovative engineers want to work anyway." After the presentation, dozens of engineers approached with questions about patent filing, IP protection, and career development. Many shared stories about innovations they'd created, but never protected. Some were already working with Foster Chapman or similar firms to document their work. The most gratifying conversation was with Maria Santos, a machine learning engineer who joined Topmark after my departure. "Your story completely changed how I think about my career," she told me. "I've filed 3 patent applications in the past year, and I negotiated an IP sharing clause in my employment contract." These were exactly the changes I'd hoped to inspire. Individual engineers were taking more control of their intellectual property rights, and companies like Topmark were adapting their policies accordingly. The old model of automatic corporate ownership was giving way to more nuanced arrangements that recognized individual contributions. Helen Torres hosted a small dinner that evening for senior engineers and executives. Over wine and excellent food, we discussed how the technology industry was evolving and what lessons could be drawn from the Topmark experience. "We learned that talent retention requires more than just competitive salaries," Helen said. "Engineers want to be recognized for their innovations, not just their ability to implement other people's ideas." The conversation was remarkably candid, with several executives acknowledging mistakes they'd made in managing technical talent. One of the VPs asked whether I'd ever considered returning to Topmark in some capacity, perhaps as a consultant or advisor. "I'm building something different now," I replied. "But I'm glad to see that Topmark has learned from what happened. The industry is better when companies treat their technical talent fairly." The visit to Topmark reinforced my conviction that the changes we'd catalyzed were both necessary and beneficial. Companies were learning to respect intellectual property rights, engineers were becoming more aware of their value, and the overall innovation ecosystem was becoming more equitable. Foster Chapman's success had also attracted attention from venture capitalists and private equity firms interested in investing in our expansion. We'd received multiple offers to franchise our model nationally or even internationally. The opportunity was tempting. We could potentially help thousands more inventors protect their rights and build substantial wealth in the process. But Delaney Crawford and I were cautious about rapid growth. Our value comes from personal attention and deep expertise, she reminded me during one of our strategic planning sessions. If we grow too fast, we might lose the qualities that make us effective. We ultimately decided to expand gradually, opening new offices only when we could maintain our standards for client service. The patent itself continued to be a source of ongoing revenue and validation. Companies were finding new applications for the predictive algorithm in industries I'd never anticipated, from agricultural optimization to space exploration. NASA's licensing deal for satellite data processing had been particularly exciting, representing a completely novel use of technology I'd originally developed for financial transactions. Each new licensing agreement reinforced the fundamental value of the innovation while generating resources that allowed Foster Chapman to take on more pro bono cases. We'd established a program to help inventors who couldn't afford legal representation, funded entirely by the success of our paying clients. Sophie's first year at MIT had been exceptionally successful. She joined a research lab focused on human-robot interaction and was already contributing to publications despite being just a freshman. Her professors were impressed by her combination of technical skills and understanding of intellectual property issues. Most engineering students don't think about patents until they're well into their careers, her advisor had told us during Parents' Weekend. Sophie already understands that innovation and legal protection go hand in hand. That's going to serve her well. The comment made me proud. Sophie was learning lessons I'd taken decades to understand. Elise's double major was proving challenging but rewarding. She'd secured a summer internship at the Patent and Trademark Office, where she'd be working on policy development for emerging technologies. I want to help write the rules that will govern IP rights for the next generation of inventors, she explained. Both girls had grown up watching their mother transform from an exploited employee to a successful entrepreneur. They understood viscerally that brilliant people deserve to be treated fairly and compensated appropriately for their contributions. These lessons would shape their entire approach to their careers. The 5th anniversary of my top mark termination passed quietly. I marked the occasion by reviewing our financial statements for Foster Chapman. We'd generated over $47 million in revenue, helping inventors protect their rights, and had secured more than $8.2 billion in licensing deals for our clients. The numbers were satisfying, but the real impact was harder to quantify. How do you measure the value of an engineer who negotiates better employment terms because they understand their rights? Or a startup founder who retains control of their key patents instead of surrendering them to investors? Or a graduate student who files patent applications for their research instead of assuming their university owns everything they create? These individual victories were creating systemic change across the technology industry. Companies were revising their IP policies, law schools were expanding their curriculum on inventor rights, and young engineers were entering the job market with realistic expectations about their value. The transformation hadn't been easy or automatic. Change never is. But the combination of legal precedents, economic incentives, and cultural shifts had created momentum that seemed likely to continue. The days of Derek Stone casually discarding brilliant engineers were numbered, not because of regulation or government intervention, but because market forces were making such behavior economically irrational. Looking back on the entire experience, I'm grateful for that devastating Thursday afternoon email. It forced me to recognize truths I'd been avoiding for years, that my work was more valuable than I'd realized, that loyalty without reciprocity is exploitation, and that brilliant people have more power than they typically exercise. Derek Stone thought he was eliminating an unnecessary expense when he fired me. Instead, he'd liberated me to build something far more valuable than anything I could have created as his employee. The irony was perfect, and the justice was complete. For any technical professional reading this story, remember, you are not replaceable. Your innovations matter. Your contributions have value. And if your current employer doesn't recognize that value, there are others who will. The only question is whether you'll recognize it yourself before someone else does.